Imagine the cool Mediterranean water embracing you as you descend, mask secured, breathing steady and measured, the world above growing distant and muffled. Below, in the harbour of modern-day Alexandria, the underwater archaeologist moves with purpose through the gentle darkness, flashlight beam cutting through the blue haze like a golden thread stitching together past and present. The ancient stones rise up before them, worn smooth by centuries of tides and time, their surfaces still bearing the marks of human hands. Greek inscriptions carved with such precision that even now, after more than 2,000 years submerged, they speak across the gulf of ages. Your gloved fingers brush against one of these stones, tracing the grooves where some ancient craftsman once worked, and in that moment there is a profound silence, a sacred quietness that seems to suspend the very notion of time itself. The weight of history presses gently against you, not with burden, but with a kind of tender inevitability, as if everything that ever mattered in the ancient world is somehow contained in these scattered remnants on the harbour floor. But our story does not begin in the depths of the sea, though water and loss are woven through every thread of it. Not far from those submerged stones, in the streets of Alexandria proper, construction workers moving through their daily tasks made a discovery that would send shivers down the spines of historians and archaeologists around the world. Breaking ground for a new development project, their tools struck something solid, something that did not belong in the expected soil layers, evidence of a sealed chamber buried deep, hidden away with apparent intention. And when that chamber was carefully opened, when its interior darkness finally gave way to careful examination, fragments emerged that should not have existed. Pottery shards bearing library catalogue marks, scraps of papyrus, brittle as moth wings and infinitely more precious, still bearing traces of ancient Greek script, stone tablets bearing part of an archive system, objects that seem to whisper a forbidden question, one that has haunted historical consciousness for nearly 2 millennia. What if the greatest library the world has ever known, the Library of Alexandria, the legendary repository of human knowledge, was not completely and utterly destroyed? This is the question that holds us tonight, dear listener, as we settle into the comfortable darkness and allow ourselves to drift backward through time, not with the jagged discomfort of sudden motion, but with the smooth gliding sensation of a descent into deep, safe water. For 2,000 years, the destruction of the Library of Alexandria has been treated as one of history's greatest tragedies, a definitive ending, a point beyond which we could not look. Imagine all those scrolls, all that accumulated wisdom, all the knowledge that humanity had managed to gather and preserve from across the known world, consumed by flames. Whether those flames came from Julius Caesar's conquest, or from religious zealots, or from the simple chaos of centuries of conflict, the result seemed the same: total annihilation, permanent loss, knowledge scattered to the winds like ash from a funeral pyre. But what if that narrative, so neat and so final, was incomplete? What if beneath the verified destruction, in the spaces between what we thought we knew, something had managed to survive? Archaeologists and historians have long wondered about this question in quiet moments, in the scholarly equivalent of the conversations people have before they fall asleep, when the rational mind loosens its grip and we allow ourselves to speculate about what might have been. Recent discoveries, revealed not with fanfare but with the careful deliberation of genuine scholarship, suggest that perhaps the truth is more complicated and more wonderful than the simple story of total loss. These new findings point toward the possibility that an ancient vault, deliberately hidden away perhaps by those who understood the value of what they protected, might have endured through all the tumult and fire and centuries of change. Some fragments of the library's vast collection might still exist, buried in the earth beneath Alexandria, waiting for the right moment, the right hands, the right questions to bring them back to light. So let us travel back now, back through the mist of ages, back to a moment when the future was still open and full of possibility, back to the year 331 before the Common Era, when a young man arrived at the Egyptian coast with an army and a vision that would reshape the entire Mediterranean world. His name was Alexander, and though he would one day be called Alexander the Great, in this moment he was simply a brilliant young general, ambitious and restless, forever moving forward, forever seeking the next horizon. He came from Macedonia in the north, the son of Philip, and he had already conquered much of the Persian Empire with a swiftness that seemed almost dreamlike to his contemporaries. But Egypt called to him, perhaps because it represented something different from conquest. It represented the possibility of foundation, of creation, of building something that would last not through military might alone, but through something more enduring. When Alexander arrived at the coast of Egypt, he did not choose the obvious harbour of the delta. Instead, his eye fell upon a narrow spit of land jutting into the Mediterranean, a place called Rakotes by the Egyptians, humble and unremarkable to the untrained eye, but strategically perfect to a mind as brilliant as Alexander's. Can you sense his presence there, standing on that shore, looking out at the water and seeing not what was but what could be? There is something almost hypnotic about imagining the moment when a great vision first takes shape in the mind of one who has the power and determination to make it real. Alexander saw a city where none stood before, a place that would unite East and West, Greek and Egyptian, commerce and culture. He would name it Alexandria, naturally, and he decreed that it should rise from that sandy shore. He did not live to see it fully realized. His conquests and his restless nature drove him onward, and he would die far from Egypt, in Babylon, still dreaming of new lands and new victories. But he had set something in motion that would outlast his brief life, that would shape the intellectual and cultural landscape of the entire ancient Mediterranean world for centuries to come. When Alexander died only a few years after his Egyptian adventure, his vast empire was divided among his generals, the men who had fought at his side through impossible campaigns and impossible odds. One of these generals was Ptolemy, called Ptolemy Soter, the saviour, and it was to him that Egypt fell as his inheritance. Ptolemy was not content to simply rule Egypt and enjoy the riches that the ancient kingdom provided. Like Alexander, though his genius expressed itself in different ways, Ptolemy saw the possibility of building something that would transcend military might and political power. He understood something profound, something that takes a certain wisdom to comprehend, that the future belongs not to those with the strongest armies, but to those who can capture and preserve and make accessible the sum of human knowledge and understanding. And so Ptolemy conceived of an idea that was revolutionary, audacious, and in its own way as ambitious as any military conquest. He would build a library, but not merely a library in the conventional sense, a place where scrolls were kept for the pleasure of the wealthy and educated elite. No, Ptolemy's vision was grander and stranger than that. He would build a library that would attempt to contain all human knowledge, all human wisdom, all that humanity had managed to discover and record from every corner of the known world. A universal library, a place that would be, in effect, the memory of human civilization itself. This vision required more than just money, though Ptolemy had considerable resources at his command. It required determination, vision, and a kind of cunning that goes often unrecognized when we speak of genius. Ptolemy understood that scrolls and manuscripts were scattered across the Mediterranean world, in Athens and Rome, in cities of the Levant and the North African coast, in the hands of wealthy collectors, and in the repositories of temples and scholars. Some owners would never part with their treasures voluntarily, and so he implemented a policy that was, from a purely practical standpoint, brilliant, but that also had a kind of audacious humour to it, a boldness that speaks to the sheer confidence of the man. Every ship that entered Alexandria's harbour, every merchant vessel and naval ship and diplomatic delegation would have its cargo inspected. Any books or scrolls found aboard would be confiscated. The ship's owners and merchants might complain, and many did, but the copies that Ptolemy would have made by the library's vast corps of scribes would be returned to them. They could sail away with copies, perfect reproductions, while the originals remained in Alexandria, added to the growing collection. Imagine the audacity of this. To simply decide that because you believed your library was more important for humanity's future than individual ownership, you would take what you wished. To copy it meticulously and return the copy to the dispossessed owner. To essentially say, knowledge is too important to be scattered. It belongs concentrated here, in this place I am building. The library that grew from this vision was not a single building, though many imagine it so. Rather, it was a vast complex, sprawling and organic, growing as Alexandria itself grew. The Mouseion, they called it, literally the shrine of the Muses, the institution that housed the library proper. But alongside it grew the Serapeum, another temple with its own library collection, and around these centres spiralled the intellectual life of the ancient Mediterranean world. Scholars were attracted to Alexandria like moths to a flame, drawing in scientists and mathematicians and philosophers and poets, many of whom would receive stipends from the Ptolemaic dynasty so that they could pursue their research and teaching without the burden of needing to support themselves through other work. The collection grew relentlessly, fed by that policy of confiscation and copying, maintained by armies of scribes who laboured day after day to reproduce and organise and catalogue the precious texts that poured in from across the known world. Some estimates suggest that at its peak, the library held somewhere between 400,000 and 900,000 scrolls, a number almost impossible to comprehend, representing the accumulated intellectual heritage of ancient Greek, Egyptian, Hebrew, Persian, Indian and other civilizations, all gathered in one place, all preserved and organised and made available to scholars and students. Think for a moment about what this would have meant, not to us with our easily accessible internet and our infinite digital libraries, but to a scholar or student in the ancient world. To want to understand something, the geometry of circles, the nature of disease, the history of distant lands, the philosophy of dead masters, the secrets of the natural world, and to know that somewhere, in this great repository of human knowledge, the answer was waiting. To have the possibility of asking almost any question and finding, not necessarily a complete answer, but the best thinking that the ancient world had managed to produce. What must it have been like to walk those corridors, to handle scrolls that had been copied from originals penned by Euclid, by Archimedes, by Hipparchus, by the greatest minds of ancient civilization? There was something sacred about the Library of Alexandria, something that transcended mere collection and storage. It was a statement about human possibility, about the capacity of our species to gather and preserve and transmit understanding across the gaps of time and distance. It was, in a very real sense, a promise about the future, a promise that what we learn today need not be lost tomorrow, that knowledge accumulated by one generation could be passed down and built upon by the next. For nearly 3 centuries, from its founding in the early Hellenistic period until the final century before the Common Era, the Library of Alexandria stood as the unquestioned centre of intellectual life in the Mediterranean world. Scholars debated its corridors, mathematicians worked out theorems, physicians studied anatomy, poets composed verses, historians recorded their understanding of the past, grammarians debated the finer points of language, philosophers developed systems of thought that would influence Western civilization for millennia to come. The library was not merely a place where the past was preserved, it was a place where the future was being actively created, where knowledge was being refined and improved and built upon. And then, gradually at first and then with increasing certainty, the world changed. Political power shifted. The Roman Empire rose to dominance over the Mediterranean. Alexandria remained important, but it was no longer the singular intellectual capital of the known world. More significant, a new religion spread through the Mediterranean lands, bringing with it new values and new assumptions about which knowledge was worth preserving and which knowledge was dangerous or irrelevant or false. Alexandria, with its vast libraries and its accumulated pagan wisdom, began to be seen with something less than admiration by some segments of the increasingly Christian Mediterranean. The great collection that had once represented the peak of human aspiration and understanding began to be viewed, by some, as a repository of error and falsehood, of knowledge that contradicted the revealed truth of Scripture. And then came the fires. Perhaps they came from Julius Caesar's fleet during the civil wars. Perhaps they came from invading armies. Perhaps they came from the hands of those who believed that certain knowledge was dangerous and needed to be destroyed. The exact causes and the sequence of events have been debated by scholars for nearly 2 millennia, and we may never have complete certainty about exactly what happened and when. But what is known is that the great Library of Alexandria, that monument to human knowledge and aspiration, was destroyed. The scrolls burned. The organisation that had been built up over centuries collapsed. The archive of human wisdom went up in smoke, and for 2,000 years this destruction has stood in the Western historical imagination as a kind of fundamental tragedy, a symbol of the way that knowledge can be lost, that understanding can vanish, that the work of generations can be erased in a moment of violence or ignorance or zealotry. But history, as any good scholar will tell you, is often more complicated than the neat narratives we construct to understand it. Sometimes the truth is less tidy than the myth, and so we come back to those recent discoveries in Alexandria, those fragments emerging from sealed chambers deep beneath the streets of the modern city, those whispers of possibility that perhaps something survived. Perhaps those ancient librarians, understanding the threat that was coming, understanding that the collection they had spent centuries building was about to be destroyed, managed to save something. Perhaps they selected the most precious texts, the ones that seemed most important, most threatened with total loss. Perhaps they sealed them away in a hidden chamber, a vault below the earth, with the hope that someday, somehow, future generations would find them. Perhaps they left them there as a message across the centuries, a kind of trust placed in the future, a belief that eventually someone would care enough to look, to dig, to preserve what had been preserved so carefully 2,000 years before. The night deepens around us as we lie here, suspended in that comfortable place between waking and sleep, between the demands of the modern world and the peace of letting go. The discovery of these fragments, these hints of survival, these possibilities of preservation, it speaks to something deep in the human spirit, doesn't it? To our desire to believe that what we value need not be entirely lost, that careful preservation and hidden hope can sometimes bridge the gap between destruction and discovery. The Library of Alexandria may have burned, but perhaps not entirely. Perhaps something precious was saved. Perhaps in the earth beneath that ancient city, fragments of the greatest library the world has ever known still rest, waiting. And if the scientists and archaeologists are right, if their discoveries are as significant as the early signs suggest, then we stand on the threshold of one of the greatest archaeological and historical revelations in modern times. The possibility that we might recover something precious that we had thought lost forever. If the Calm Archive has become part of your bedtime routine, consider subscribing so you never miss a new upload, and so you can drift into sleep alongside us as we continue to explore the mysteries of history and the wonders of the past. For now, settle deeper into your pillow, let your breathing slow and deepen, and allow yourself to sink further into the peaceful darkness as we continue our journey into the mysteries of the Library of Alexandria. As the great doors of the Library of Alexandria opened each morning to the Nile's gentle breeze, scholars from every corner of the known world made their way into what many considered the most sacred place on earth, not because it was a temple to the gods, though it sat adjacent to one, but because it was a temple to something far more precious in the minds of these learned men, knowledge itself. The complex they entered was called the Mouseion, the Temple of the Muses, and it was unlike anything that had existed before or would exist again in quite the same form for many centuries to come. To walk through the Mouseion at dawn was to step into a dream of what human civilization could be, when it chose to prioritize the gathering and preservation of human thought above all else. The Mouseion was not simply a building, though its architecture was extraordinary in itself. It was rather an entire compound, a self-contained world dedicated to scholarship and intellectual pursuit. Imagine walking through its entrance as the first light of morning touches the marble columns that line the outer portico. The air itself seems different here, charged with purpose. You move through a series of covered walkways that connect multiple structures, each serving a distinct purpose in the grand machine of knowledge production. These walkways were not merely functional, they were lined with columns in the classical Greek style, creating a rhythm of light and shadow as you moved between them. Scholars could stroll these passages for hours, their minds turning over ideas, their voices echoing gently off the stone. These were the places where some of the ancient world's greatest intellectual debates took place, where a mathematician from Syracuse might encounter a physician from Pergamon, where a botanist from Egypt might offer insights to a geographer from Greece. At the heart of the complex lay the great library hall itself, a building whose interior spaces were carefully designed to facilitate the work of serious scholarship. The reading rooms were positioned to capture the most advantageous natural light, and the ancient architects had designed the high windows with considerable sophistication, allowing sunlight to pour in during the morning and early afternoon hours without creating the harsh, eye-straining glare that would make reading uncomfortable. Imagine the sensation of settling into one of these reading rooms with a papyrus scroll in your hands, the morning sun warming the marble floor around you, the smell of the ancient plant fibres faint in your nostrils, the world outside growing quiet as you lose yourself in the words written across the page. The reading rooms maintained a cool temperature even during Alexandria's hot summers, a mercy for which scholars were profoundly grateful. The walls were constructed with an understanding of how sound travels, dampening echoes and creating pockets of acoustic privacy, so that one scholar's concentration would not be disrupted by another's noisy pursuit of knowledge in a neighbouring room. But it was not the reading rooms alone that made the Mouseion extraordinary. Surrounding these spaces of individual study was an elaborate physical infrastructure designed to house, organise, and preserve the vast accumulation of written knowledge that Alexandria had been collecting. The scrolls themselves, rolls of papyrus, that fragile yet surprisingly durable material made from the stems of the papyrus plant, were stored in a system that would not be matched in sophistication for centuries. Picture rows upon rows of shelving, honeycomb-like structures that have sometimes been compared to the pigeonholes used by modern postal workers. These shelves were carefully designed to keep the scrolls in an upright position, as if they were soldiers standing at attention, waiting to be called upon to share their contents with eager minds. Each scroll was identified with a small clay label, a tag bearing essential information about its contents. These labels were not mere afterthoughts. They were crucial to a system of organisation that required considerable thought and planning. As the collection grew larger and the challenge of locating specific works became more complex, the librarians of Alexandria developed increasingly sophisticated methods for keeping track of everything in their possession. In the early years, simple organisation by subject or by the author's name might have sufficed, but as the collection swelled to what eventually became something on the order of 700,000 scrolls, a number that would have been almost incomprehensible in its scope, a far more elaborate cataloguing system became necessary. This need gave rise to what may have been the single greatest intellectual achievement of the Library of Alexandria, the creation of the Pnyx, the world's first systematic library catalogue. The Pnyx was compiled by Callimachus, a poet and scholar of extraordinary learning who understood that a library is only as useful as one's ability to locate materials within it. The Pnyx itself was a monumental work, spanning 120 scrolls, an entire collection unto itself, devoted solely to listing and describing the works contained within the greater library. It organised books by author, by subject, by literary genre. It provided biographical information about writers. It included excerpts from longer works. To create this catalogue, Callimachus had to read, analyse and describe hundreds of thousands of individual texts. One can only imagine the scholar surrounded by scrolls, working hour after hour, day after day, year after year, creating the first index to human knowledge. The Pnyx became so famous, so essential, that copies were made and distributed to scholars and libraries throughout the ancient world. In a very real sense, Callimachus invented the modern library catalogue, a system we still use today, though we now employ computers where he employed human memory and papyrus. The Mouseion existed not merely as a collection of books, however grand, but as a living community of scholars. To understand what made this place truly unique, one must imagine the daily rhythms of scholarly life within its walls. A scholar, let us say a geometrician from Rhodes, would arrive at dawn, as many did, having perhaps slept in the comfortable quarters that the Mouseion provided for its resident scholars. The complex itself contained housing for these men of learning, rooms that were simple but comfortable, clean and well maintained, far superior to what most people could afford. As the scholar made his way to the library's reading rooms in the early morning hours, he would pass other scholars already engaged in their work or just beginning theirs. The air would be filled with the quiet rustling of papyrus scrolls, the scratch of styluses on papyrus or on wax tablets. Note-taking was encouraged, as new ideas were meant to build upon old ones. The light at this early hour would be soft and perfect for the work of reading. Throughout the day, the library was a place of purposeful activity. Scholars would work individually, moving between different texts, cross-referencing ideas, verifying information. But the Mouseion was never meant to be merely a collection of silent readers. At regular intervals, the covered walkways and colonnaded courtyards came alive with debate and discussion. Imagine a cluster of scholars gathered in the afternoon, standing in the dappled shade of a portico, one of them perhaps holding a scroll, pointing to a particular passage that contradicted another scholar's claim. Their voices would rise and fall in the cadence of serious intellectual argument. These were not heated, angry disputes, but rather the careful, methodical work of minds testing ideas against each other, sharpening understanding through discourse. The Mediterranean sun would beat down beyond the shelter of the columns, while these men stood in the cooler shadow, their togas or robes hanging loosely in the heat, their minds fully engaged. Food and nourishment were provided with the same care that the Mouseion devoted to intellectual sustenance. The complex contained a great communal dining hall where all the resident scholars gathered to share meals. These were not quick, solitary repasts eaten in isolation. Rather, mealtimes were occasions for the continued exchange of ideas, a chance for scholars from different disciplines to interact in a less formal setting than the library proper. The wine was good, the food wholesome and well prepared, and the conversation was invariably centred on matters of intellectual importance. It was not uncommon for a scholar to become so engaged in a discussion over a meal that he would lose track of time entirely, the bread and fish growing cold on his plate, as his mind raced with new possibilities sparked by what a colleague had just said. And occasionally, if the discussion was particularly significant, or if some major discovery had just been announced, the kings of Egypt themselves, the Ptolemies who had made the building of the library their special project, would join the gathering to hear directly from the scholars about their latest findings. To imagine a Ptolemaic king, dressed in the finest linens, reclining near a group of intense scholars as they debated some crucial question of mathematics or medicine or philosophy, is to glimpse a political system that, whatever its flaws, had managed to organise itself around the principle that knowledge is a worthy goal. Beyond the reading rooms and the dining halls, the Mouseion complex expanded into a series of gardens and specialised facilities that reflected an understanding of knowledge that was far more comprehensive than we might expect from an ancient institution. There were botanical gardens where plants from across the known world were cultivated and studied. A scholar interested in the medicinal properties of herbs, or a botanist seeking to understand the diversity of plant life, could walk through these gardens and actually see specimens from distant lands. Egypt itself, with its unique climate and fauna, provided rich opportunities for the study of natural history. But the gardens were more than just collections of plants. They were outdoor classrooms and laboratories where students could learn directly from nature itself. The air would carry the scent of flowering plants, the sound of bees and birds, and the sight of colours that could inspire wonder and curiosity in the mind of anyone open to learning. The Mouseion even housed a zoo, a collection of living animals from throughout the known world and from the exotic lands that lay beyond. Elephants, giraffes, unusual birds, and creatures that few Greeks had ever seen in person were kept in conditions as humane as the ancient world allowed. These animals served both a symbolic and a practical purpose. They were symbols of Alexandria's power and wealth, but they were also resources for the study of biology and natural history. A zoologist or natural philosopher could observe animal behaviour directly, could study their anatomy, could begin to build a systematic understanding of the diversity of life on Earth. The sounds of the zoo, the calls of exotic birds, the distant rumble of an elephant's movement, would have been a constant backdrop to life in the complex, a reminder that the world was vast and filled with wonders yet to be understood. Looking upward from these earthly collections, the Mouseion maintained an astronomical observatory, a facility devoted to the study of the heavens. Alexandria was well positioned for astronomical observation, and Egyptian astronomy had a long and honoured tradition stretching back thousands of years. At the Mouseion, scholars could observe the movements of the planets and stars, could track the seasons of the sky, could begin to build mathematical models that would help explain the great celestial mechanisms. In the evenings, when the desert sky above Alexandria grew clear and the stars emerged in their multitude, astronomers would ascend to the observatory to pursue their observations. The slow, patient work of watching the heavens unfold night after night, recording data, comparing observations with those made by previous astronomers, was one of the great scholarly enterprises of the ancient world. And it was carried out within the Mouseion, contributing to an understanding of the cosmos that would influence human thought for centuries to come. The daily life of a scholar at the Mouseion was one of almost unimaginable privilege when judged by the standards of the ancient world. These men wanted for nothing in the material sense. They were given housing, provided with food and wine, their labours supported by the wealth of the Egyptian state and the patronage of the Ptolemaic kings. They paid no taxes. They received salaries sufficient to ensure their comfort and to free them entirely from the necessity of engaging in any labour beyond their scholarship. In an era when most people, regardless of how talented or intelligent they might be, were compelled to spend their days in work that had nothing to do with their true interests, the scholars of the Mouseion had been freed from such necessity. This was not accidental. It was a deliberate policy, an investment in the belief that when brilliant minds are given the freedom to pursue knowledge without distraction, extraordinary things will result. The Ptolemies had calculated that the prestige and power that would accrue from being the patrons of the world's greatest centre of learning would be worth the expense, and history suggests they were right. The scholarly community at the Mouseion was not a closed parochial group. Rather, it was deliberately cosmopolitan, designed to draw the finest minds from across the known world. A mathematician might come from Syracuse, a physician from Pergamon, a grammarian from Egypt itself, a historian from Asia Minor. This diversity of origin brought with it a diversity of perspective and methodology. It meant that the latest discoveries and theories circulating in one corner of the Mediterranean world would quickly become known in Alexandria, debated, tested, and either incorporated into the growing body of knowledge or challenged and refined. The Library of Alexandria, through its scholars, was connected to an intellectual network that spanned the entire Hellenistic world, and as that world was essentially the entire known world to people of that era, it meant that the library was, in a very real sense, the repository of human knowledge itself. As the Library of Alexandria grew more vast and more celebrated, it became clear that a single institution, no matter how grand, could not serve all the learning needs of an entire city, and so the Ptolemies, in their wisdom, authorized the establishment of a daughter library, a secondary collection housed in the great temple of Serapis that stood in another quarter of Alexandria. Where the Mouseion was an elite institution, restricted largely to the scholars and researchers of the highest caliber, the library of the Serapeum was designed to serve a broader population. It was more accessible, its collections somewhat less extensive but still remarkable, and it offered the citizens of Alexandria a way to pursue learning even if they were not among the rarefied few chosen to reside and work at the Mouseion. The Temple of Serapis itself was one of the most magnificent buildings in Alexandria, a structure of such beauty and size that it drew pilgrims and worshippers from throughout Egypt. The library within it was positioned in a way that allowed the casual visitor to the temple to wander into the stacks, to peruse the scrolls, to encounter knowledge in a more serendipitous way than the more formal methods of the Mouseion. It was a democratization of learning, a recognition that the pursuit of knowledge should not be restricted to the elite, that the seeds of great understanding might be found in unexpected places and unexpected people. The physical organization of the Library of Alexandria, with its honeycomb pigeonhole shelving, its papyrus scrolls carefully labelled and catalogued, its great reading rooms positioned to catch the perfect light, its communal spaces for debate and discussion, its botanical gardens and zoo and astronomical observatory, its dining halls where the greatest minds of the age gathered over wine and food, the comfortable housing provided to scholars, the complete freedom from material want that was granted to those who worked within its walls. All of this represented an extraordinary investment in the life of the mind. It was a bet made by the Ptolemies and their advisors that when you remove all obstacles between brilliant people and the pursuit of knowledge, when you gather the finest minds in history under one roof, when you preserve the written word with care and make it accessible and organized and searchable, something remarkable will result. And as the evening light slanted through the high windows of the reading rooms, casting long shadows across the stone floors, and as the last scholars of the day reluctantly left their work and made their way toward the communal dining hall, or back to their quarters to rest before the next day's labours, one might have felt walking through the Mouseion at twilight that this was indeed the centre of the world, not its political centre, but its intellectual heart, the place where human understanding itself was being built, scroll by scroll, debate by debate, discovery by discovery, in that remarkable institution beside the Nile. Imagine walking through the marble corridors of the Library of Alexandria in the 3rd century before Christ. The afternoon light filters through high windows, casting long geometric shadows across the floor. Around you, the greatest minds of the ancient world move through these halls like figures in a dream. They carry scrolls, they debate in hushed tones. They are reshaping everything humanity will ever know. These were not distant figures lost to history. They were real people who breathed the salt air rising from the harbour, who felt the weight of papyrus in their hands, who gathered in this one extraordinary place, at this one extraordinary moment in time, and their collective brilliance would echo through the centuries long after the library itself had turned to ash. Let us begin with a man named Euclid. He came to Alexandria in the time of Ptolemy I, drawn by the promise of the library, and the patronage of a king who understood that knowledge was a form of immortality. Euclid was a teacher, a systematizer, a man obsessed with the elegant architecture of mathematics itself. Around him swirled questions about the nature of space, about angles and lines, about the fundamental shapes that compose all visible reality, and rather than scattering his answers across philosophical treatises and isolated theorems, Euclid did something revolutionary. He organized everything he knew, everything that was known about geometry, into a single comprehensive work. He called it The Elements. This was not a book that would be read once and forgotten. For more than 2,000 years, The Elements would remain the standard geometry textbook of the world. Think about that span of time, longer than the entire history of Christianity, longer than the existence of Islam, longer than the age of industrialization. For 2 millennia, geometry students from Baghdad to Beijing to Oxford learned from the very words Euclid had written within those library walls. He created not just a text, but a foundation, a way of thinking about space and proof that would support every building, every bridge, every architectural wonder that came after. There is a famous story about Euclid and his patron Ptolemy I. The king, used to his royal prerogatives, asked Euclid if there was perhaps a shorter path to learning geometry, perhaps some royal shortcut that would allow him to understand the subject without all this tedious work. And Euclid, with the gentle firmness of a true scholar, replied with words that have echoed through the ages, "There is no royal road to geometry." What he meant was this: there are some truths that cannot be hurried. Some knowledge cannot be obtained through privilege or power or wealth. Every person, from the humblest servant to the greatest king, must walk the same patient path if they wish to truly understand. This answer tells us something profound about the library itself. It was built on the idea that truth was democratic, that understanding came through careful work and honest inquiry, not through the accident of birth. But while Euclid was mapping the abstract realm of shapes and proofs, another mind in the library was turning those same principles of geometry toward the physical world itself. His name was Eratosthenes, and what he accomplished is so remarkable that even today, standing in the modern world with all our satellites and instruments, we cannot help but admire the elegance of his thinking. Eratosthenes asked a question that must have seemed almost absurdly ambitious. How large is the Earth? This was not a question one could answer by travelling. No one in his time could circumnavigate the globe, and yet, using nothing but geometry, careful observation, and the basic tools of measurement, Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth with an accuracy of within 2%. 2%. Think about what that means. He lived 1700 years before Columbus sailed west, and he knew the size of the planet more accurately than most educated people would know it until the modern age. How did he do it? Through the simple observation of shadows. Eratosthenes knew that in the southern city of Siena, in Upper Egypt near what is now Aswan, there was a deep well that the sun illuminated completely on the day of the summer solstice at noon. This meant that on that day, at that moment, the sun's rays fell perfectly perpendicular to the earth. Meanwhile, in Alexandria, where he lived and worked as chief librarian of the great library, the sun at the same moment cast a measurable shadow. Its rays fell at a slight angle to the vertical. This angle was the key to everything. If he could measure it, he could calculate the answer. And so Eratosthenes, or someone working under his direction, took a simple measuring instrument called a gnomon and used it to determine the angle of the sun's shadow in Alexandria on the summer solstice at noon. The angle was roughly 7.2 degrees, which meant that the sun's rays in the two cities were separated by that same angle. Since the Earth is a sphere, that angle represented a small fraction of the complete 360 degrees around the circle. If 7.2 degrees accounted for the distance between Alexandria and Syene, then the full circle of 360 degrees would account for the entire circumference of the planet. The math was elegant and simple. The angle represented about 1/50th of a complete circle. So the distance between the two cities, multiplied by 50, would give the total circumference. The distance between Alexandria and Syene was measured at about 5,000 stadia, a unit of measurement used in the ancient world. Multiplied by 50, this gave a circumference of roughly 250,000 stadia. In modern measurements, this translates to approximately 40,000 kilometers. The actual circumference of the Earth is 40,075 kilometres. Eratosthenes had calculated it to within 0.25%. Let yourself rest for a moment in this accomplishment. A man in Alexandria, working with a stick and his geometry, touching nothing but shadows and mathematics, had measured the entire world. He had taken the invisible and made it knowable. He had taken the vast and cosmic and brought it within the realm of human understanding, and he did this 2,000 years ago. Let us hold this thought gently, like something precious. The human mind, when given the right questions and the right freedom to think, can know almost anything. While Eratosthenes gazed outward at the cosmic scale, another scholar in the library was gazing in a different direction, not at the earth and sky, but at the very structure of the solar system itself. His name was Aristarchus of Samos, and he proposed an idea so radical, so contrary to the accepted wisdom of his age, that it would take humanity nearly 2,000 years to fully accept it. Aristarchus looked at the movements of the celestial bodies and asked a simple question. What if we have it backward? What if the Earth does not sit at the centre of all things, with the sun and stars revolving around us? What if instead the Earth and the other planets orbit the sun? What if we are not the centre of the cosmos, but merely one body among others, travelling in an eternal circle? This was heresy in his time. The prevailing belief, shaped by both observation and vanity, was that the Earth was stationary at the centre of a rotating universe. It seemed obvious when you stood on solid ground and watched the sun move across the sky. And more than that, it satisfied something deep in human nature, the desire to believe that we occupied the most important position in creation. Aristarchus challenged both the common sense and the ego of his age. His idea was rejected. He lived and died largely forgotten, his heliocentric model dismissed as absurd. And yet he was right. 1,700 years would pass before Copernicus revived the heliocentric theory. Another century would pass before Galileo's telescopes provided the evidence that would transform it from hypothesis to fact. But the seed had been planted in Alexandria, in the library, in the mind of a single scholar brave enough to look at the world and ask if what everyone believed might be false. Sometimes the greatest power of a library, of a place dedicated to knowledge, is its ability to preserve ideas that the world is not yet ready for, waiting for the day when human understanding catches up to human imagination. It was to this same library, to this same nexus of brilliance, that Archimedes came before he returned to his home in Syracuse. Archimedes is remembered as perhaps the greatest mathematician and engineer of all antiquity. The stories of his achievements have become almost legendary. His principle of buoyancy, supposedly discovered while bathing and causing him to run naked through the streets shouting, "Eureka!" His mirrors supposedly used to set enemy ships aflame. His screw for lifting water, his systems of pulleys and levers, his calculation of pi to extraordinary precision. But before all these wonders, before he became the figure of legend, Archimedes studied at the Library of Alexandria. He absorbed the knowledge that had been assembled there. He learned from the mathematical traditions that had been preserved and expanded within those walls. He may have studied directly under the influence of Euclid's elements, which by that time had already become canonical. And in that place, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of the ancient world, Archimedes' genius was shaped and refined. The library did not make him a genius, but it gave his genius the tools and the foundation it needed to change the world. As we breathe, as we rest, let us recognize something profound. These minds were not isolated geniuses working alone in ivory towers. They were part of a community. They walked the same corridors. They debated in the same courtyards. They consulted the same scrolls. They lived in a place that had been deliberately created to bring the best minds together in service of human knowledge. The Library of Alexandria was not just a repository of books. It was a living, breathing organism of inquiry. Now let us turn our attention to a different kind of discovery. While Euclid was mapping the abstract realm and Eratosthenes was measuring the earth, another group of scholars was pushing into territory that many considered forbidden. They were asking questions about the human body itself, and they were willing to find the answers in the most direct way possible. Their names were Herophilus and Erasistratus, and they conducted something that had never been done before at such a scale and with such systematic purpose. They performed the first comprehensive human anatomical dissections. In a time when many cultures considered the human body sacred and inviolate, when the very idea of cutting into a corpse was viewed as sacrilege, these two men opened bodies and looked inside. And what they found rewrote human understanding of how we are made. Before Herophilus and Erasistratus, anatomical knowledge had come largely from the dissection of animals and from battlefield observations, wounds that revealed what lay beneath the skin. But the human body is not simply a larger version of a dog or a monkey. There are differences, sometimes subtle, sometimes profound. By systematically dissecting actual human remains, Herophilus and Erasistratus began to map the true architecture of human anatomy. Herophilus made a particular discovery that would have tremors throughout medical science. He traced the intricate pathways of nerves throughout the body, the delicate white threads that carried sensation and command throughout every part of us. Before Herophilus, no one had understood that these structures even existed as a distinct system. The nervous system, the very mechanism by which our bodies feel and move and think, was invisible until he revealed it. He traced nerves from the brain to every extremity. He began to understand that the brain itself, not the heart, was the centre of consciousness and thought. Erasistratus, meanwhile, made discoveries about the cardiovascular system. Before him, the distinction between arteries and veins was not clearly understood. He traced the intricate network of blood vessels and began to comprehend how blood moved through the body, how the heart pumped, how life itself seemed to flow through these channels. He even proposed something approaching the modern concept of blood circulation, though the full understanding would not come until the Renaissance. Think about this for a moment. These men, working with the tools and knowledge available to them, were beginning to understand the most intimate secrets of human existence. They were revealing the machinery of life itself, and they were doing this work in Alexandria, in the library, as part of the great collective effort to know and understand everything. The final scholar we must honour is different from the others. While the previous names we have discussed are celebrated for their grand discoveries, for their mathematical proofs and their anatomical revelations, Callimachus performed a task that may be less dramatic but was no less essential to the library's existence and function. He created order. The Library of Alexandria, by the time Callimachus arrived as its chief librarian, contained hundreds of thousands of scrolls. These were not organised books on neat shelves with cool numbers and clear categories. They were rolls of papyrus, each one containing texts or portions of texts, many written in different languages, many on different subjects. Imagine the chaos. Imagine a scholar searching for a particular work on mathematics or medicine or history, not knowing where to begin looking. Callimachus understood that knowledge is only useful if it can be found, and so he created the Pinnaces, a revolutionary catalogue system. It was not merely a list of titles. It was an organised, annotated bibliography organised by subject and author, with descriptions of the contents of each scroll. It was essentially the first library card catalogue. Through this system of organisation, Callimachus transformed the library from a magnificent but chaotic treasure trove into an actual instrument of knowledge, a place where a scholar could find what they needed. In our modern age, when we have search engines and databases and algorithms that organise the entirety of human knowledge in microseconds, it is easy to underestimate what Callimachus accomplished. But he gave the library life. He made it functional. He created the possibility for the scattered brilliance of Euclid and Eratosthenes and Aristarchus to be accessed and built upon by others. Without Callimachus's work, the library would have been a magnificent museum. With it was something far greater, a living repository of human civilization, accessible and alive. These scholars, Euclid with his eternal geometry, Eratosthenes measuring the earth with shadows and mathematics, Aristarchus dreaming of a sun-centered cosmos, Herophilus and Erasistratus opening the mysteries of the human body, Callimachus organising infinity into order, they all breathed the same air, they all walked the same stone corridors, they all lived and worked in this one place at this one time in history. And their collective endeavour changed the trajectory of human civilization. Some of their ideas would be lost for centuries, some would be rejected and then rediscovered. Some would flow in an unbroken line through the generations, shaping every discovery that came after. But all of them, all of these remarkable minds, were shaped and nourished by the library. They were given the freedom to think, the resources to research, the community of peers to challenge and inspire them. And in return, they gave to the library and to humanity a legacy that would outlast empires and dynasties. As you rest and listen, let these names and these faces exist in your mind. Let the Library of Alexandria become real to you, not a distant historical artifact, but a living place full of light and thought and human effort. These people were not gods. They were not mythical beings. They were scholars who asked questions and pursued answers with patience and brilliance and courage. And the library they inhabited was the greatest manifestation of human intellectual aspiration the world had yet seen. In a moment, we will turn our attention to what happened to this extraordinary place and to the remarkable discovery of a hidden vault that survived the centuries. But for now, let yourself rest in wonder. Let yourself imagine standing in those corridors, breathing that air surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of civilization. This was real. This existed, and the echoes of it still reach us across 2,000 years of time. But the Library of Alexandria did not meet its end in a single moment of dramatic flame and fury, as so many stories would have us believe. That would be too simple, too neat. The truth is far more melancholic, far more human. The greatest repository of human knowledge the ancient world had ever known did not burn in one apocalyptic fire. Instead, it died slowly over centuries, through a series of wounds both violent and subtle, dramatic and quiet. It died of siege and politics and religious fervour and simple, creeping neglect. It died the way empires die, not with a bang that echoes through history, but with 1,000 small collapses that blur together into an inevitable decline. Picture Alexandria in the year 48 before the Common Era. The city sits on the edge of chaos. Julius Caesar, the great Roman general, has come to Egypt pursuing his political rivals, and now he finds himself trapped. Ptolemy XIII, the young pharaoh, has turned against him, and Caesar's forces are besieged in the harbour, surrounded by hostile soldiers. Desperate to escape and desperate to win, Caesar makes a choice that will reverberate through history. He orders his fleet set aflame. If he cannot sail to victory, then neither can his enemies. The ships burn, and the fire spreads like a living thing, hungry and consuming. It races from the harbour to the docks, from the docks to the warehouses that line the shore, great stone structures filled with goods meant for trade and distribution across the Mediterranean world. Imagine that harbour glowing orange in the ancient evening, the sky itself seeming to bleed. The heat would have been intense, the smoke choking and thick. Scrolls stored in those warehouses. Ancient sources speak of 40,000 of them, caught fire and were consumed. The loss was staggering, a tragedy unto itself. But here is what the historical record suggests, and what we must sit with in these quiet moments. The main library, the great Mouseion complex with its main collection, likely did not burn that day. It stood further inland, removed from the harbour's chaos, protected by distance if not by fortune. The scrolls destroyed in Caesar's fire were likely copies, duplicates waiting to be exported to distant lands, part of the practical machinery of an ancient library's operation. The core collection survived, wounded perhaps, diminished in some ways, but still standing, still alive, still full of the accumulated wisdom of centuries. But survival in that moment was not salvation. It was merely a reprieve. What happens next unfolds with the inexorable logic of tragedy, the kind that moves not through violent action but through slow erosion, through the grinding pressure of political change and historical forces too large for any individual to resist. The centuries that follow see Rome rise to complete dominance over Egypt. The Ptolemaic dynasty fades. Roman emperors, with their own agendas and their own sources of power, begin to view the Mouseion differently than the Hellenistic kings who founded it had. The funding starts to diminish, subtly at first. Fewer resources are allocated to the purchase of new texts. The salaries of the scholars who work in the library begin to stall. The network of connections that once brought rare manuscripts from across the known world begins to fray. The great assembly of minds that once gathered in Alexandria, drawn by the promise of unlimited access to human knowledge, begins to thin. Fewer scholars arrive, fewer stay. The intellectual community that was the true lifeblood of the library, the living spirit that animated all those scrolls and gave them meaning, starts to dissipate like morning mist. In the year 216 of the Common Era, nearly 300 years after Caesar's fire, an emperor named Caracalla makes a decision that would have seemed unthinkable to the enlightened rulers of the past. He bans foreign scholars from Alexandria. Not all scholars, mind you. just those who came from beyond the Roman Empire, from the distant reaches of the known world. On the surface, this might seem like a minor administrative matter, the sort of bureaucratic act that leaves no trace in the romantic imagination. But consider what it means. Consider what it represents. For centuries, the Library of Alexandria had been a beacon, a destination, a place where the greatest minds of the ancient world could come together to study and debate and build upon the knowledge of their predecessors. That beacon was now being shuttered. The openness that had defined it was being replaced by restriction and control. The scholars who remained grew older. They retired, or they died, or they left to seek opportunity elsewhere. Their students, knowing that advancement was no longer promised, began to pursue other paths. The tradition of learning that had been passed from one generation to the next began to break. Gaps appeared in the chain of knowledge, texts that required interpretation, texts that required understanding within a living tradition of scholarship began to lose their context. The library continued to exist in a physical sense, but something essential had begun to drain away. It was becoming less a living centre of learning and more a repository of silent objects, important perhaps, but increasingly mysterious, increasingly disconnected from the active intellectual life of the world. For more than a century, this slow decline continues. The library stands, but it withers. The manuscripts gather dust. The scholars who once debated in its halls are gone, replaced by librarians who maintain the collections but who lack the deep knowledge of their predecessors. Some texts are lost not to fire but to simple neglect, to the slow corruption that comes when a scroll is never read, never handled, never preserved by the hands of those who understand its value. And then, in the year 391 of the Common Era, the slow decline becomes something sharper, something more violent. By this time, the religious landscape of the Roman Empire has transformed completely. Constantine has embraced Christianity, and Christianity has become the official religion. In Alexandria, a Christian bishop named Theophilus holds considerable power and influence. He has decided that the pagan temples of the city represent a threat, a lingering echo of an older world that must be extinguished. Among these temples stands the Serapeum, the great temple of Serapis, the Egyptian god of healing and fertility, one of the most important religious sites in Alexandria. But the Serapeum is more than a temple. For centuries it has also served as a library. A daughter collection to the great Mouseion, it houses scrolls and manuscripts continuing the tradition of preserving human knowledge. In 391, mobs of Christian monks and zealots, encouraged by Bishop Theophilus, descend upon the Serapeum. They come to destroy, and they succeed. The temple is ransacked, statues are toppled, the temple itself is burned, and the scrolls and manuscripts housed there, texts that had survived Caesar's fire nearly 400 years earlier, are scattered, destroyed, lost to flame and neglect. This destruction has a different character than Caesar's fire. There is religious fervour behind it, a sense of ideological purpose. These are not scrolls destroyed as collateral damage in a military conflict. These are texts deliberately targeted for destruction, because they represent ideas and beliefs that are no longer welcome in the world that is being born. It is difficult to overstate the symbolic weight of this moment. The Serapeum Library was not the main Mouseion, but it was significant. More importantly, it represented something. It represented the idea that knowledge, all knowledge, deserved to be preserved. And now that idea was being rejected in favour of a different vision, a vision in which only certain knowledge was worthy of preservation, in which some texts should be deliberately destroyed rather than preserved. The fire that consumed the Serapeum was not merely the destruction of objects, it was a statement. It was the assertion of a new world view, one in which the ancient world's commitment to preserving all human knowledge was no longer a sacred principle. What remains of the great library after the destruction of the Serapeum is uncertain, fragmentary, poorly documented. Did the main Mouseion still stand? Were there still collections of manuscripts housed in its halls? Scholars debate these questions endlessly, and honest history requires us to admit that we do not know with certainty. What we do know is that the intellectual community that gave the library meaning was gone. The tradition of learning had been broken. The network of scholars that stretched across the Mediterranean had dispersed. The library, if it still existed, was a shadow of what it had been. A magnificent building, perhaps, still standing, but a building that had lost its purpose, an archive whose secrets were no longer being read. And then, in 642, 250 years after the destruction of the Serapeum, the Arab armies of Caliph Omar conquer Alexandria. With them comes a story so perfect, so dramatically satisfying, that it would echo through the centuries to come. According to this tale, when Caliph Omar learns of the Great Library, he is unmoved by its historical significance, unimpressed by its accumulated wisdom. He issues an order. The scrolls should be used as fuel for the bathhouses of the city. And when advisors question this decision, he responds with words that have been quoted and misquoted countless times. If they agree with the Quran, they are unnecessary. If they disagree with the Quran, they are dangerous. Burn them all. It is a story of deliberate cultural destruction, of barbarism, of the triumph of dogmatism over learning. It is a story that many people still believe to be true. But here is what we must understand, sitting here in this quiet moment, preparing ourselves for sleep and reflection. This story is almost certainly false. It is almost certainly a fiction, invented centuries after the supposed events, created by later writers for reasons we can only guess at. By the year 642, when Omar's armies entered Alexandria, there was almost nothing left to burn. The great collections had been scattered, destroyed, dispersed across centuries of decline. The scholars had been gone for hundreds of years. The intellectual tradition had been broken. The library, even if some remnants of it still existed in physical form, was no longer a living institution. It was no longer the great beacon of learning that it had been. There were no 40,000 scrolls in some vault waiting to be discovered. There was no dramatic library waiting to be burned in one final act of destruction. The library had already been destroyed, but it had been destroyed slowly, so slowly that perhaps no one had even noticed it happening. And so Omar, whether by choice or by circumstance, did not destroy the Library of Alexandria, because by that time, history had already done the job for him. This is perhaps the most important and most difficult truth about the fall of the Library of Alexandria. We want the story to be simple. We want it to be dramatic. We want to be able to point to a single moment, a single villain, a single conflagration and say, here is where the library was destroyed. Here is where the tragedy occurred. It is much harder to live with the truth, which is that the library was destroyed gradually over centuries through the actions of countless people making countless decisions, most of them probably not even aware that they were participating in a tragedy. Caesar did not mean to destroy the library when he ordered his ships burned. The Roman emperors did not mean to destroy it when they reduced its funding. Bishop Theophilus did not mean to destroy the Library of Alexandria in its entirety when he ordered the Serapeum destroyed. He was pursuing his own religious and political goals, and Caliph Omar did not destroy it at all, though he has been blamed for it. The destruction was not the result of malice or barbarism or deliberate cultural genocide. It was the result of the slow grinding away of support, the gradual withdrawal of the resources and the attention that kept it alive. It was death by 1,000 cuts, not by a single blow. And yet the loss was real. The tragedy was real. Thousands upon thousands of texts were destroyed. Countless works by ancient thinkers, entire genres of knowledge, entire schools of thought were lost. We will never know exactly what we lost, because much of it we never even knew existed. We read the works of the major Greek philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, but these are only a tiny fraction of what was written in the ancient world. For every text that survived to be copied and recopied through the medieval period, until it could be printed in the modern world, there were probably dozens or hundreds of texts that perished. When the Serapeum burned, dozens or hundreds or thousands of unique manuscripts were lost. When scholars stopped coming to Alexandria, the tradition of learning that kept certain texts alive through continuous interpretation and commentary was broken, and texts that depended on that tradition eventually became impossible to understand and so were discarded. We are the poorer for these losses, though we may never fully understand just how poor we are. We study the history of the ancient world through a filter, seeing only what survived to be copied and preserved. We are reading a fragment of a fragment, understanding only a pale ghost of the intellectual life that once flourished in these great Mediterranean civilizations. The Library of Alexandria stood as a symbol of humanity's commitment to knowledge, to learning, to the preservation of what humans have discovered and created. And that commitment, that beautiful and fragile commitment, ultimately could not survive. It could not survive political change. It could not survive religious transformation. It could not survive the simple entropy of time and the gradual withdrawal of the resources and attention needed to maintain it. If you're enjoying this journey through history with the Calm Archive, a like on this video helps more people find us. Your support allows us to continue bringing you these meditative explorations of the past, these quiet moments of reflection on the grand sweep of human civilization and the precious, fragile legacy we carry forward. And yet, there is something remarkable in all of this. Despite everything, despite Caesar's fire and Roman neglect and religious fervour and the slow, grinding entropy of centuries, knowledge survived. Not all of it, but some. Some texts were copied before the library fell. Some manuscripts were carried away by scholars who fled the city. Some knowledge was preserved in the memories and writings of those who had learned from the great library before its decline. The Library of Alexandria may have been destroyed, but the library in a larger sense, the accumulation of human knowledge and wisdom, persisted. It persisted in incomplete form, in fragmentary form, in scattered and often barely recognizable form, but it persisted, and that persistence, that remarkable resilience, is perhaps the true legacy of Alexandria. Not the building that once stood on the shore of the Mediterranean, but the invisible library that lives on in all the places where humans continue to preserve and value and share knowledge with one another. As we journey deeper into the night and deeper into history, we find ourselves standing at the threshold of one of humanity's most profound paradoxes. We have been speaking of loss, of the great library and the fires that threaten to consume it. But loss, dear listener, is never the complete story. The human desire to preserve, to remember, to pass forward the wisdom of ages. This desire is as old as knowledge itself, and it leaves traces that echo through the centuries. Let us pause for a moment and consider something that might seem impossible. Of the 123 plays written by the ancient Greek master Sophocles, only 7 survive to our present day. 7. Just 7 of the works that moved audiences in amphitheatres beneath the Mediterranean sun, that made people laugh and weep and question the very nature of fate and human suffering. Those 7 plays, Antigone, Oedipus Rex, Electra, Ajax, Trachiniae, Oedipus at Colonus, Philoctetes, they are the entirety of his legacy that we can now read with our own eyes. The numbers whisper their melancholy across the generations. Of Aeschylus's 90 plays, merely 7 survive the centuries. Imagine standing in that grand library, surrounded by shelves that held the complete works of these titans of drama, and then imagine watching as only a fraction of those words would echo into the future. The library contained philosophical treatises from schools of thought that today exist only as fragments quoted in other texts, remembered only through the references of those who came later and bothered to mention them. There are works that we know existed because ancient scholars wrote about them, argued with them, built upon them. We have entire systems of thought, whole schools of philosophy, known to us only through the footnotes of history. A complete body of work by Democritus, the ancient atomist whose ideas prefigured modern physics by over 2,000 years, has vanished entirely. We know he wrote extensively because later writers quoted him, debated with him, referenced his ideas. But his actual words, gone. The scientific treatises, the histories that scholars laboured to compose, the mathematical proofs and astronomical observations that might have changed the trajectory of human understanding, many are lost to us forever. This is where the story becomes more gentle, more hopeful. For loss, while real, is not absolute. Knowledge, in ways that seem almost miraculous when we think carefully about them, has a way of finding paths to survival. The Library of Alexandria was magnificent, revolutionary, a gathering place of learning unlike anything the ancient world had known. But it was never the only repository of knowledge. It was never the only place where humans felt the sacred responsibility to preserve what had been learned. Consider the simple, profound act of copying. Long before the library's existence, scholars understood something fundamental. If you want an idea to survive, you must write it down, and then you must write it down again. You must trust it to others who will also recognize its value and pass it forward. The Library of Alexandria was a centre of this copying tradition, yes, but it was a centre within a much larger, slower, more distributed network of preservation that spanned the ancient world. Monks in monasteries throughout Egypt and the Mediterranean region were copying texts, creating duplicates that would be stored in different locations, protected by different communities. Scholars in other cities were doing the same. The library's collection was vast, perhaps containing hundreds of thousands of scrolls at its height, but it was not the sole guardian of these texts. The seeds of knowledge had been scattered far and wide, and so, when calamity came, whether sudden flame or slower decay, those seeds continued to grow in distant gardens. This is perhaps the most soothing truth we can contemplate as we consider the library's fate. The knowledge did not all vanish. Much of it took a more circuitous path through time, but it survived. Begin to imagine, if you will, the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. Picture a place in the 8th century of the Common Era, in the golden age of Islamic scholarship, where the Caliph al-Ma'mun had gathered the greatest minds of the known world. It was a library, an academy, a centre of learning and translation that would rival even Alexandria in its ambition and its brilliance. While Europe stumbled through its medieval darkness, this magnificent institution burned with intellectual light. The scholars of the House of Wisdom understood their responsibility. They sought out the surviving texts of the Greeks and Romans, many of them traced back through the copying traditions that had carried knowledge eastward and southward as the classical world fragmented and transformed. These scholars did not merely preserve these ancient texts. They translated them, they commented on them, they built upon them, they synthesized them with knowledge from Persian, Indian, and Arabic sources. They were not content to be mere custodians. They were active, engaged inheritors of the great tradition. Aristotle's works, which form the foundation of Western philosophy and science, survived largely through this Islamic preservation. The mathematical elegance of Euclid, whose principles would shape geometry for 2,000 years, came down to us through the hands of Muslim scholars who copied and commented on his proofs. The astronomical observations of Ptolemy, the medical knowledge of Galen, the technological innovations of Hero of Alexandria, all of these survived because they were valued, copied, translated and integrated into the living intellectual conversation of the Islamic Golden Age. Without the House of Wisdom, without the scholars who laboured in Baghdad and in cities throughout the Islamic world, the classical knowledge that the Library of Alexandria had gathered might well have been lost entirely. When the European Renaissance arrived centuries later, when scholars in Italy and Greece began to eagerly collect ancient texts, they found that many of the works they sought existed in Arabic translations, preserved through the long centuries of the medieval period. The knowledge that would spark the Renaissance, that would ignite the scientific revolution, that would ultimately lead to the modern world we inhabit. This knowledge had been kept alive by the very communities that many Western histories had dismissed or marginalized. This is a gentle lesson to carry with you as you rest. Knowledge, true knowledge, cannot be easily destroyed. It finds ways to survive, often through the dedication of people whose names we do not know, working in obscurity, motivated by nothing more than the profound human conviction that what is worth knowing should not be lost. And the story does not end with Baghdad. Throughout the medieval period, other centres of learning preserved what they could. Byzantine monasteries in Constantinople held manuscripts that copied the copying of the Greeks. Irish monks, in their remote island monasteries, laboured by candlelight to copy and preserve texts in Latin, maintaining the thread of learning through the dark ages of Europe. These were different traditions, different locations, different communities, but all animated by the same deep instinct to preserve and transmit knowledge to future generations. Imagine the patience required for this work. A monk sitting in a cold stone room, his fingers numb in the winter, copying letter by letter the words of philosophers he might not fully understand but recognized as valuable. His was a quiet kind of heroism, one that rarely received recognition in the chronicles of history. Yet without his laborious work, without the work of countless others like him, the entire inheritance of human knowledge would have been infinitely poorer. Now, as we move into our modern era, something remarkable has begun to happen. We have begun to recover fragments of the Library of Alexandria that we did not even know had survived. Our sophisticated technologies, our patient archaeological work, our willingness to look closely at the dusty remains of the ancient world, all of these have allowed us to retrieve pieces of knowledge that we thought were forever lost. The story of the Oxyrhynchus papyri is one of those stories that seems to belong more to legend than to history, yet it is entirely true. In 1896 and 1897, archaeologists working in Egypt made an astonishing discovery. In the ruins of an ancient settlement, Buried beneath layers of sand and time, they found what had once been a rubbish heap, a garbage dump, a place where ancient people had discarded waste, including broken pottery, worn-out household items and old documents that no longer seemed to have value. But here is where the story becomes magical. The dry Egyptian climate, the sand and the heat, had preserved the papyri in this dump in ways that would have been impossible in damper regions. Over 500,000 papyrus fragments were recovered from that site. Fragments that would have disintegrated to nothing if exposed to moisture and the typical processes of decay. And these fragments, these humble remnants of the past, contained treasures beyond imagination. Lost plays by the great Greek dramatists, poems by poets whose names we knew but whose words had vanished, passages from the Gospels among the earlier surviving versions, mathematical texts, medical treatises, fragments of history. Scientists and scholars have spent more than a century cataloguing these fragments, carefully preserving them, studying them, attempting to reconstruct what they once were. The work continues to this day. Each fragment is like finding a single puzzle piece that has been lost for nearly 2,000 years. When you fit enough pieces together, sometimes you can see the outline of what the whole image might have been. The Oxyrhynchus papyri represent a kind of archaeological miracle. Knowledge, deemed worthless in its own time, has been rescued and recognized as precious by our age. Or consider, if you will, the Archimedes palimpsest. This is perhaps the most intimate story of knowledge's struggle to survive. In the 10th century, somewhere in the Mediterranean world, a manuscript containing the original Greek works of Archimedes, one of the greatest mathematicians and physicists who ever lived, was taken. A monk or a scribe in a monastery looked at this ancient text and made a decision. The parchment was expensive, the manuscript was old, perhaps deteriorating, and so the decision was made to scrape away the original text, to wash it as clean as possible, and to reuse the parchment to write a prayer book. This sounds like destruction. This sounds like tragedy. A monk erasing genius to make room for devotion. And yet, the ink of Archimedes' original text did not entirely disappear. It sank into the fibres of the parchment. It remained, invisible but present, like a ghost haunting the pages beneath the prayers and religious texts that were written on top. For centuries, for nearly 1,000 years, this prayer book, known as a palimpsest, was copied and recopied, moved from monastery to monastery. No one realized that beneath the visible text lay the mathematical genius of Archimedes. It was simply a religious text, treated as any other, preserved because it was deemed valuable enough to warrant copying. Then, in our modern age, technology arrived that could do what human eyes and careful examination could not. X-ray imaging, powerful and sensitive beyond what previous generations could imagine, was turned upon those ancient pages. And slowly, like a photograph developing in chemical baths, the words of Archimedes began to emerge from beneath the prayers. An entire work that had been thought lost, The Method, a treatise in which Archimedes described his approach to solving mathematical problems, was revealed. A genius, erased and covered and hidden, was speaking once again across the centuries. This is the kind of miracle that science and patience can achieve. This is the kind of recovery that seems to validate, in some deep way, the conviction that knowledge cannot truly be destroyed. It can be hidden, lost from view, forgotten, but not ultimately destroyed. There is always a chance, always, that some future generation, with new tools and new understanding, will find ways to bring it to light again. And the story of recovery does not end there. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in the year 79 of the Common Era, burying the Roman cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum beneath volcanic ash and pumice, it also buried a remarkable library. The Villa of the Papyri, a grand private collection, was sealed away beneath the volcano's fury. Over 1,800 years later, when archaeologists began to excavate the site, they found hundreds of scrolls, carbonized by heat but still present, still intact, though impossibly fragile. For centuries these scrolls could not be read. Scrolls, to unroll them would be to destroy them. They were too brittle, too fragmented. The only way to know what they contained was to damage them, and no one wanted to take that risk. So they remained, tantalizing in their proximity. You could hold them in your hands, you could see that they were books, but you could not read them. In recent years, something remarkable has changed. New imaging technology, powered by particle accelerators and artificial intelligence, has made it possible to read these scrolls without unrolling them. Scientists use X-ray technology and advanced algorithms to penetrate the carbonized layers to detect the subtle differences between the carbon-based ink and the burned papyrus beneath. Computer programs trained on known texts can help translate the fragmentary images into readable words, and slowly, inch by inch, word by word, the scrolls are speaking again. In 2023, the Vesuvius Challenge, a competition among computer scientists and archaeologists, successfully read the first substantial passages from one of these sealed scrolls, a letter. Private correspondence from nearly 2,000 years ago, written during the time of the early Roman Empire, preserved by catastrophe, and finally revealed through the patient work of modern science. It is a moment that seems to capture something essential about humanity's relationship with knowledge and memory. We lose things. We preserve them through disaster. We find them again, often through means we could never have imagined. As you rest now, contemplating these stories of recovery and preservation, begin to understand the deeper pattern. The Library of Alexandria did burn. Knowledge was lost. But knowledge, it seems, has roots deeper than fire can reach. It spreads itself through copying and transmission, through the quiet dedication of scholars in distant places, through the accidents of preservation that leave traces for future generations to find. The plays of Sophocles that were lost at Alexandria live on through other copies made before or after the fire. Copies distributed among scholars and centres of learning throughout the ancient world. The works of Aristotle came down to us through Islamic translators who recognized their value and incorporated them into their own intellectual tradition. The papyri in Egyptian rubbish dumps and the scrolls buried beneath volcanic ash have emerged in our own time, releasing whispers and words that seemed lost forever. This is a profound meditation on the nature of loss and preservation. It suggests that nothing of true value is ever completely lost. It may be hidden, it may be forgotten, it may be transformed and translated and carried through unexpected channels. But the universe, in ways that we are only beginning to understand, seems reluctant to let genuine knowledge vanish entirely. As you drift deeper into sleep, allow yourself to find comfort in this knowledge. The great library may be gone, but the knowledge it contained has not entirely vanished. It has been preserved in ways both obvious and miraculous. It continues to speak to us across the centuries, in the words we still read, in the discoveries we still make, in the truth that continues to shine through despite all the attempts of time and fire to dim it. Knowledge survives, it finds ways, it persists, and in this persistence we find not tragedy, but hope. And so, the story of the Library of Alexandria is not truly a story of destruction, though destruction is part of it. It is a story of persistence, of the quiet refusal of knowledge to be extinguished entirely, of the way that human understanding, once kindled, spreads outward in ways that no single fire can ever fully contain. The scrolls may have burned in Alexandria, but the ideas they carried had already taken root in minds across the ancient world, had already been copied onto fresh papyrus in distant cities, had already been translated into new languages and absorbed into new traditions. The library was never truly a single building. It was a network of minds stretching across centuries and continents, each one carrying forward some fragment of the whole, each one preserving what they could against the long darkness of forgetting. Imagine for a moment the Mediterranean Sea as it laps against the modern shores of Alexandria today. The water is warm and inviting on the surface, but beneath those gentle waves lies something extraordinary. Since 1992, a dedicated group of marine archaeologists led by the French underwater explorer Frank Godiot has been slowly revealing what remains of the ancient royal quarter of Alexandria, the very heart of the Ptolemaic kingdom that once housed that magnificent library. These explorers descend into the murky green depths, their flashlights piercing the darkness to illuminate stone faces of forgotten pharaohs who have lain undisturbed on the seabed for nearly 2,000 years. The work is painstaking and meditative in its own way. Picture the divers moving slowly through the water, their equipment barely disturbing the ancient silence. Around them, colossal statues emerge from the sediment, statues that once stood proud in courtyards and temples, their carved features still recognizable despite centuries of submersion. Sphinxes with enigmatic smiles rest on beds of ancient rubble. Massive temple columns, some of them twice the height of a man, lie scattered like fallen giants across the harbour floor. The divers use underwater photography and careful mapping to document every discovery, slowly piecing together the geography of a city that quite literally sank beneath the waves. What the archaeologists have found is almost dreamlike in its completeness. The ancient harbour district is there, mapped out in 3 dimensions beneath the water. Streets that once echoed with the footsteps of merchants and scholars can now be traced along the seabed. Palace complexes, their foundations still visible, reveal themselves slowly as the sediment is carefully excavated and removed. Artifacts emerge, fragments of pottery with inscriptions, coins bearing the profile of Ptolemaic rulers, blocks of stone with carved hieroglyphics still partially visible. Each discovery is a small thread in the vast tapestry of ancient life, a confirmation that the city's glory was not merely legend but archaeological fact. The subsidence that drowned Alexandria happened gradually, over centuries. Earthquakes shifted the ground beneath the city's feet. The Mediterranean, patient and relentless, claimed what the earth had weakened. What was once a thriving port became submerged, and eventually most people forgot that these wonders lay just below the surface of the harbour, where fishing boats now bobbed and commercial vessels moved through the modern shipping lanes. But the stone remembers. Granite and marble do not lose their memories, and when Godiot and his team began their systematic exploration, they discovered that time had actually preserved much of what lay below, preserved it in a kind of underwater museum, sealed away from the fires and looters and neglect that claimed so much of Alexandria's visible heritage. These underwater discoveries connect directly to the Ptolemaic period, to the very dynasty that built and sustained the Library of Alexandria. The statues and sphinxes that rest on the harbour floor date from the same era as Ptolemy I and Ptolemy II, the rulers who envisioned a repository of all human knowledge. When you see photographs of these submerged colossal heads, these gigantic stone faces staring upward through the eternal darkness of the Mediterranean, you are looking at the world as those ancient rulers would have known it. These monuments once stood in the city that was the intellectual capital of the ancient world. But the story of Alexandria does not end with underwater archaeology and ancient ruins. In fact, as you rest and drift towards sleep, consider this. The very impulse that created the Library of Alexandria, the desire to collect knowledge, to preserve it, to make it available to all who seek it, this impulse never truly died. It lives on, transformed but recognizable in the modern world. In 2002, on the shore of modern Alexandria, near the very site where the ancient library once stood, a remarkable building was unveiled. The Bibliotheca Alexandrina, as it is called, is a conscious and deliberate heir to the ancient library, a statement in stone and steel that Alexandria's dedication to knowledge continues unbroken into the 21st century. Picture the building as it rises along the waterfront, a massive circular disc of a roof, tilted at an angle as if the building itself is bowing in respect to something greater than itself. The roof catches the light of the Mediterranean sun, gleaming and subtle by turns. The exterior of the Bibliotheca is covered with carved letters, characters from every known alphabet in human history: Arabic, Latin, Greek, Cyrillic, Hebrew, Chinese, Japanese, Korean. The languages of human civilization are literally inscribed into the building's skin. To walk around the structure is to move through a written history of humanity's attempts to communicate, to record, to make meaning out of the infinite complexity of existence. The architects and designers who created this building understood, on a deep and almost spiritual level, that they were building a temple to human language itself, to the miracle of the written word. Inside, the Bibliotheca houses millions of books. The main reading room is vast and circular, capable of seating 2,000 people at a time, 2,000 minds, all gathering in one space to pursue knowledge, just as scholars once gathered in the ancient library. The light in this reading room is carefully designed, soft and even, falling gently across tables and carrels where readers sit in concentration. There are specialized archives, museums, collections dedicated to particular subjects and periods. There are rare book rooms where ancient manuscripts are preserved under controlled temperature and humidity. The building is, in essence, a modern reimagining of what the ancient library might have been, translated into the architectural language of our own time. The Bibliotheca Alexandrina serves as a symbol and a practical reality simultaneously. It reminds us that the impulse to gather knowledge, to organize it, to preserve it, and to share it with anyone who wishes to learn, this is one of humanity's noblest and most enduring impulses. The building stands as a bridge between the ancient world and our own, saying silently but powerfully, What was lost can be replaced. What was destroyed can be rebuilt. The work of preservation and learning never truly ends. Yet there is another dimension to this story, one that becomes more apparent and more urgent with each passing year. In our contemporary world, a new kind of Library of Alexandria has emerged, born not in a physical location, but in the vast, interconnected networks of the digital world. The Internet Archive, a non-profit organisation founded in 1996, has taken on the monumental task of collecting and preserving the digital heritage of human civilization. It is, in many ways, our modern Library of Alexandria, a vast repository of digitized books, websites, audio files, video recordings and other digital materials that represent the breadth of human knowledge and culture. At the heart of the Internet Archive is the Wayback Machine, a project that seems almost miraculous in its ambition. The Wayback Machine takes snapshots of websites as they exist at particular moments in time, preserving them in a vast archive. If a website disappears tomorrow, if a company goes out of business and takes its digital presence with it, the Wayback Machine may have captured a version of that site, frozen at a particular moment, preserved for future generations. It is as if someone is constantly making copies of human knowledge and culture, storing those copies in a vast digital vault where they will be safe from the ravages of time. Digital libraries and open-access journals represent another aspect of this modern preservation effort. Scholars and researchers around the world are increasingly making their work available freely online, accessible to anyone with an internet connection. Project Gutenberg has digitized over 70,000 books, many of them classics of literature and learning that are now free to read online. Google Books has scanned millions of texts, making them searchable and accessible to people who might never have had access to a physical library. The impulse behind these projects is the same impulse that motivated the founders of the ancient Library of Alexandria, the belief that knowledge should be preserved and shared, that no person should be denied access to learning because of geography or economic circumstance. The parallels between the ancient library and our modern digital preservation efforts are striking and worth contemplating as you drift towards sleep. Both represent humanity's highest aspirations regarding knowledge and learning. Both are built on the assumption that preserving information is one of civilization's fundamental obligations. Both attempt to collect not just some knowledge, but as much knowledge as possible, to create a comprehensive record of human thought and creativity. Both are, in their way, acts of faith in the future, acts that say, what we preserve today may be invaluable to people we will never meet, in times we cannot imagine. But there is another parallel that should give us pause, even as we rest. The ancient Library of Alexandria was vulnerable. For all its grandeur and importance, for all the resources devoted to its creation and maintenance, it could be destroyed. And destroyed it was. Whether through fire or neglect or deliberate acts of destruction, the specific mechanisms matter less than the fundamental reality. A library, no matter how magnificent, is only as permanent as the political and economic systems that support it. When those systems change, when power shifts, when priorities shift, even the greatest repository of knowledge can disappear. Our modern digital libraries face similar vulnerabilities, though of a different character. Digital data can be lost through server failures or corrupted by malware. Digital files can become obsolete as technology evolves. A floppy disk from the 1980s is now nearly impossible to read without specialized equipment. Companies that host digital content can go bankrupt or change their policies, making previously available information inaccessible. Governments can censor digital content or take systems offline. The Internet, for all its apparent boundlessness, is ultimately a collection of servers and data centers and communication networks, all of which can be damaged, destroyed, or simply abandoned. This is why the work of digital preservation is so crucial, and why organizations like the Internet Archive perform such vital service. They represent a kind of modern wisdom about the fragility of knowledge in any form. They understand that preservation is not a one-time act, but a continuous, ongoing effort. Data must be refreshed and migrated to new storage formats as old ones become obsolete. Multiple copies must be maintained in different physical locations so that no single disaster can destroy everything. The work is expensive and sometimes unglamorous, but it is essential. As you rest and reflect on these themes, consider the broader truth about knowledge and learning that these stories reveal. The impulse to collect, organize, preserve, and share knowledge is not unique to any single culture or era. It is, in fact, one of humanity's universal traits, one of the characteristics that defines us as a species. Every public library in the world, from the largest metropolitan library to the smallest lending library in a rural village, is in a sense a descendant of the Library of Alexandria. Each one embodies the same fundamental belief, that knowledge should be gathered, that it should be preserved, and that it should be accessible to anyone who seeks it. Think of the librarians throughout history and around the world who have devoted their lives to this work. Think of the countless individuals who have given their time and resources to making information available to others. Think of the volunteers who digitize old books, the archivists who carefully preserve documents, the programmers who build systems to store and organize knowledge. These people are all, in a sense, heirs to the ancient librarians of Alexandria. They carry forward a tradition that extends back over 2,000 years, a tradition that says, knowledge matters, preservation matters, access to learning matters. The Library of Alexandria, whether we speak of the ancient library or the modern bibliotheca, or the vast digital libraries of our contemporary world, represents a profound statement about human values. It says that we believe the accumulated wisdom of humanity, scientific discoveries, philosophical insights, stories, poetry, history, mathematics, medicine, all of this is worth preserving. It is worth the effort, the expense, the careful attention that preservation demands. It is worth passing on to future generations. And perhaps this is the most soothing thought to carry with you as you drift towards sleep. That somewhere, in libraries and archives and digital vaults all around the world, people are working to ensure that knowledge survives, that learning continues, that the great conversation of human civilization, the conversation that began thousands of years ago, and that includes voices from every culture and every era, will continue into the future. The Library of Alexandria may have burned, but the impulse it represented did not. It transformed, evolved, took new forms, but it endured. And in that endurance, in that stubborn human commitment to learning and preservation despite all obstacles, there is something profoundly hopeful. As you close your eyes and let yourself sink deeper into rest, you might imagine yourself walking through the Bibliotheca Alexandrina, or descending in a diving suit beside Frank Gaudio to see the submerged treasures of the ancient city, or scrolling through the vast digital archive of human knowledge available at the click of a button. In all these spaces, knowledge is being preserved. Learning is being protected. The great work continues, generation after generation, each one adding their own contributions to the vast library of human civilization. If you've been enjoying this series about the places and stories that shaped human history, tell someone about the Calm Archive tonight. You might help them find the sleep they've been looking for, and you might introduce them to a companion for their journey into rest and reflection. The Calm Archive is here, waiting, with more stories to unfold as you drift toward the quiet peace of sleep. As we reach the end of our journey through the Library of Alexandria, through the ashes and the recovery, through the flames and the faithful hands that preserved what could be saved, let us pause and consider something that rarely gets spoken about in histories of the ancient world. It is not the famous names we remember. It is not Caesar or Cleopatra, or even Ptolemy himself who kept the knowledge alive across the centuries. No, it was the quiet work of people whose names we will never know. It was the anonymous scribe sitting by candlelight in a room that was never warm enough, copying word by painstaking word from a crumbling scroll onto fresh papyrus. It was the monk in a cold monastery in Ireland, his fingers numb, his breath visible in the darkness, preserving Latin texts that no one around him could read, preserving them anyway because he believed they mattered. It was the Islamic scholar in Baghdad or Damascus or Cairo, translating Aristotle and Euclid from Greek into Arabic, keeping alive the knowledge that Europe itself had forgotten, had let slip away into darkness. It was the librarian hiding books in the walls during a war, or burying them in sealed chambers beneath the earth, risking everything for paper and ink and ideas. It was the archivist today, in our own time, working with crumbling manuscripts that are falling apart in their hands, digitizing them one page at a time, racing against time and decay, because knowledge matters and beauty matters, and the preservation of what humans have thought and felt and discovered, that matters more than almost anything else. These are the true heroes of civilization. Not the conquerors, not the generals who built empires and conquered lands and left monuments to their own vanity. No, the true heroes are the preservers, the quiet people, the ones who understood that knowledge is fragile, that everything we build, everything we learn, everything we discover, everything we understand about the world and ourselves, it can all be lost in a single fire, in a single moment of carelessness or violence or indifference. And so they devoted their lives to preventing that loss. They gave their quiet, unglamorous service to the idea that what humans have learned should not be forgotten, that a poem written 2,000 years ago might still speak to someone's heart today, that a scientific observation made by an ancient astronomer might help us understand the universe, that a philosopher's argument about justice or love or the good life might still matter, might still move someone, might still change a mind. Think about that as you rest tonight. Think about all those hands, all those careful hands working in candlelight and moonlight and lamplight, copying and preserving and protecting. Think about the sacrifice involved in that work, the cold rooms, the aching fingers, the strain on the eyes, the repetitive motion of hand and pen, hour after hour, day after day, year after year. Many of those scribes never saw their work completed. They died before the task was done, and someone else picked up the pen and continued. Generation after generation continuing the work of their ancestors, never knowing if it would matter, never knowing if anyone in the future would care about what they were preserving. But they did it anyway, and because they did, we know their names, we know their words, we hold their thoughts in our hands and in our minds, and we continue that work today. In a different form but the same essential work. The librarian who stays late cataloguing new acquisitions, the book conservator who repairs damaged spines and restitches pages, the archivist who transfers old recordings to digital formats to preserve them for future generations, the teacher who passes on what she has learned, the parent who reads a story to a child at bedtime, keeping alive the tradition of stories and the belief that stories matter, the writer who puts words on a page, not knowing if anyone will read them, but doing it anyway because the act of creating, of expressing, of preserving thought and feeling, that is worth doing in itself. This is the dignity of work if you think about it. Not the grand work of building empires or winning battles or becoming famous, but the quiet work of tending to what matters, of caring for the precious things, of saying, this is worth saving, this is worth my time and effort, this is worth protecting. The Library of Alexandria stands as a monument to that kind of work, not because it was perfect or because it survived intact, but because so many people believed in it. So many people gave their time and their talents to keeping it alive, and when it burned, so many people worked to recover what they could, to rescue what they could, to make sure that the loss was not total, that some part of the great collection would survive and could be rebuilt. And in a way, that is the ultimate lesson of the Library of Alexandria. It is not that the library itself mattered, it is that the knowledge mattered, the ideas mattered, the books mattered, and they mattered enough that people risked everything to save them, that people devoted their lives to recovering them, that people continue thousands of years later to study the fragments that survived, to learn from them, to teach others about them. The library as a physical place is gone. The great stone building, the reading rooms, the catalogue system, the organisation of scrolls, all of that is gone. But what the library contained lives on. The knowledge lives on. The books live on. The ideas live on. And they live on because people chose to preserve them. Now, as you prepare to drift into sleep, I want you to think about something else. The mind is a kind of library too. Did you know that? Your mind, right now at this very moment, is filled with a vast collection, not of papyrus scrolls, but of memories, of experiences, of knowledge you have gathered throughout your life, of conversations you have had, of books you have read, of moments you have lived through, of dreams you have dreamed. All of it is stored in there, in the quiet spaces of your consciousness. All of it is organised and catalogued and filed away, some of it accessible to you now, some of it waiting just beneath the surface of your awareness, some of it so deeply stored that you might never retrieve it again, but it is all there. Your mind is an enormous library, and you are both the librarian and the collection. And sleep is when your mind does its work of preservation and organisation. It is when your mind takes all the experiences of the day, all the sensations, all the conversations, all the things you saw and heard and felt and thought about, and it files them away. It organises them. It connects them to other memories. It discards what is not essential. It preserves what matters. It is during sleep that your mind repairs itself, that it processes emotion, that it makes meaning out of experience, that it transforms what happened into memory, that it strengthens the neural pathways that encode what you have learned. Sleep is not a time of inactivity. Sleep is not a time of nothing. Sleep is a time of profound work. The most important work your mind does happens while you're sleeping. The consolidation of memory, the processing of emotion, the repair of damaged neural tissue, the strengthening of the immune system, the restoration of balance in your chemistry. All of this happens in the darkness while you rest. Your mind is like a great librarian, moving through the corridors of consciousness, tending to the collection, organizing, filing, preserving, repairing, and as you drift towards sleep right now, as you feel your eyes becoming heavier and your breathing becoming slower and your muscles becoming more and more relaxed, you are entering your own private library, a place that belongs only to you, a place where everything is ordered and safe, a place where all your memories and all your thoughts and all your experiences are arranged in a way that makes sense. You're walking through the corridors of your own mind, the corridors of sleep, and there is no one there but you. The lights are soft, the temperature is perfect, the air is still, everything is quiet. Imagine walking through the Library of Alexandria at night. Imagine it as it might have been in those quiet hours before dawn, when all the scholars had gone to sleep, when all the readers had gone home to their beds, when the library belonged only to itself and to the night. The reading rooms are empty now. The long tables where students bent over their scrolls are bare. The chairs are empty. The lamplight has been extinguished or reduced to a single small flame somewhere far away. Moonlight is streaming through the high windows, casting long, pale rectangles of light across the stone floor. The light is soft and silver and otherworldly. It illuminates the dust motes drifting through the air. It makes the shadows darker and deeper and more mysterious. The scrolls are resting in their pigeonholes now, thousands upon thousands of them, perhaps hundreds of thousands, arranged on shelves and in cubbies and in storage rooms that stretch back into darkness. They are at peace. The knowledge they contain is dormant now, waiting. The words are resting. The ideas are resting. The histories and the poems and the scientific treatises and the philosophical arguments and all the accumulated wisdom of the ancient world, they are all resting now, silent and safe, waiting for the morning light and the next reader who will come looking for knowledge. The corridors are silent. You can hear almost nothing. Perhaps the faint whisper of wind from somewhere outside passing through a high window. Perhaps the creak of the building as it settles in the cool night air. Perhaps the quiet sound of a mouse or a small creature moving somewhere far away. But mostly silence. The most profound silence. The silence of a place dedicated to knowledge and study and the preservation of thought. The silence of a place where all the noise of the day has finally ceased. Where all the voices have gone quiet. Where all the activity has stopped. There is a faint smell in the air. The smell of papyrus and ink. The smell of old paper and old leather and the dust of centuries. It is not an unpleasant smell. It is the smell of age and knowledge and history. It is a smell that speaks of time passing, of human effort preserved in physical form, of all the hours that countless people have spent reading and writing and copying and preserving these scrolls. The smell is comforting in a way. It is the smell of civilization itself, the smell of minds connecting across time, and you are walking through this library now in the night, in the moonlight, and you are alone. No scholars, no librarians, no visitors, just you and the scrolls and the silence and the moonlight. Your footsteps are soft on the stone floor. Your breathing is slow and steady. Your mind is quiet. You're not looking for anything in particular. You're not trying to solve any problems. You're not trying to learn anything or achieve anything. You're simply walking, simply being present in this place, simply allowing yourself to rest in the knowledge that countless human beings have worked to preserve knowledge, to save ideas, to keep alive the things that matter. The corridors stretch before you and behind you, left and right, up and down, an impossible geometry of shelves and scrolls and hallways and rooms. You could walk here forever and never see everything. There is too much knowledge, too much history, too much that humans have thought and felt and discovered. But you do not need to see everything. You simply need to rest in the knowledge that it is all here. It is all safe. It is all preserved. All of it has been saved by people who believed that it mattered. And as you walk deeper into the library, deeper into the silence and the moonlight and the coolness of the night, You feel your eyes becoming heavier. Your breathing is becoming slower. Your body's becoming heavier, sinking deeper into whatever you're resting on, into the softness beneath you. Your thoughts are becoming slower too. The constant chatter of the waking mind is fading. The worries of the day are fading. The tasks left undone are fading. The conversations you meant to have are fading. The things you meant to do are fading. All of it is fading like the moonlight fading as the night deepens. And this is good. This is exactly as it should be. Your mind is doing its work. Your mind is taking all of that, all of those worries and tasks and thoughts, and it is filing them away. It is preserving them in the library of your consciousness. It is organizing them. It is making sense of them. Your mind is a great librarian, and it is tending to the collection now. It is getting things in order. It is preparing the shelves for tomorrow's new experiences. It is making space for rest. It is making space for sleep. The library grows deeper and quieter as you walk. The moonlight becomes softer. The shadows become darker. The air becomes cooler. Your eyelids are becoming heavier now. They are becoming so heavy, so very heavy. You can feel the weight of them. You can feel how much they want to close. They are like the great doors of the Library of Alexandria itself, heavy and wooden and ancient, wanting to swing shut, wanting to close out the day and seal in the night and the rest and the peace. And there is no need to fight that heaviness. There is no need to fight against your eyes closing. This is not a battle. This is a surrender, a good surrender, a necessary surrender. You're surrendering to sleep just as the Library of Alexandria has surrendered to the night, just as all the scholars have surrendered to sleep, just as all the knowledge in the library has surrendered to silence and rest. This is the natural order of things, the rhythm of waking and sleeping, the rhythm of activity and rest, the rhythm of day and night. You are part of that rhythm. You have always been part of that rhythm. And right now, at this moment, it is time for rest. It is time for sleep. Your breathing has become very slow now, very gentle, in and out, in and out. Like the breath of someone very deeply at peace, like the breath of someone who has finally let go of all their worries, like the breath of someone who has finally reached home. And in a way you have. You have reached the place where you belong. The place where all humans belong at the end of the day. The place of rest, the place of sleep. The place where the day is finally released and the night can begin its work of restoration and repair. Thank you for spending your evening with the Calm Archive. If this helped you relax tonight, subscribe so you never miss a new video. I upload every day, and there's always something new to drift off to. Tell me in the comments, if you could visit any ancient wonder, which one would it be? And as you drift now, as your mind becomes softer and softer, imagine that you are still in the Library of Alexandria. You have come to rest in one of the reading rooms. There is a comfortable seat beneath you. The moonlight is washing over you like a gentle wave. The smell of papyrus and ink surrounds you. The silence enfolds you. The knowledge is safe. Everything is safe. Your mind is a library too, and all of your knowledge and all of your memories and all of your experiences are safe in there. Everything is organized. Everything is filed away. Everything is preserved. And you can let go now. You can release your grip on the day. You can allow yourself to sink deeper and deeper into the softness of sleep. The Library of Alexandria is waiting for you in your dreams. The endless corridors, the moonlit reading rooms, the scrolls at rest, the silence, the peace, the knowledge that humans have worked across all the centuries to preserve what matters, to save what is beautiful, to keep alive what is true, and that work continues even now, as you sleep. Your mind is doing its work. Your mind is a librarian. Your mind is preserving. Your mind is organizing. Your mind is restoring and repairing and getting ready for another day. But not yet. Not for many hours yet. For now, there is only rest. There is only the gentle darkness. There is only the sensation of your body becoming heavier and heavier, sinking deeper and deeper into sleep. There is only the sound of your own breathing. There is only the knowledge that you are safe, that all is well, that you can let go. And so you do. You let go. You drift. You release. You allow yourself to fall gently, slowly, peacefully into sleep, into the Library of Alexandria, into the corridors of your own mind where everything is quiet and everything is safe, and everything is preserved forever in the darkness and the moonlight and the endless peaceful silence.